London fog clung to the streets like a shroud, muffling the distant chime of Big Ben. Inside 221B Baker Street, Sherlock Holmes lounged in his mouse-colored dressing gown, his keen eyes dulled by boredom. Then came the urgent knock at our door, the telegram from Scotland Yard. Dr. Elias Thornwood, renowned botanist, found dead in his Kew Gardens greenhouse, apparent poisoning from his own exotic plants. A tragic accident, they said, but Holmes spotted an ember, a single, misplaced leaf fragment on the victim's cuff, from a species not grown in England. A spark of deception in the midst of natural beauty. From Baker Street, the deductive fire ignites. Chapter 1. The first spark. I find myself once again setting pen to paper at 221B Baker Street to record one of the strangest and most illuminating cases Sherlock Holmes and I ever encountered. The events I am about to relate took place in the dank November of 1892, when London lay smothered beneath a fog so thick it seemed the very gas lamps struggled to breathe. Inside our rooms the coal fire crackled defiantly against the bitter cold seeping through the window frames, filling the air with the comforting smell of burning coal mingled with the sharp bite of Holmes's shag tobacco. The 17 steps from Mrs. Hudson's hallway below had become as familiar to me as my own heartbeat. Yet on this particular evening those steps carried an urgency that set my military instincts on edge. Holmes lounged in his mouse-colored dressing gown, legs stretched toward the hearth, plucking idle, melancholy notes from his Stradivarius violin. The gas lamps hissed softly. Scattered chemical papers and the Persian slipper stuffed with tobacco gave the room its usual scholarly chaos. He had been in one of his black moods for days, starved for intellectual fuel, when Mrs. Hudson's knock sounded sharp against the door. She entered bearing a yellow telegram envelope, her cheeks flushed from the raw wind outside that carried the reek of Thames mud and horse manure up from Baker Street. "From Inspector Lestrade, Mr. Holmes," she said, handing it across with a meaningful glance. Holmes tore it open with one swift motion, his languid posture vanishing in an instant. His grey eyes flashed with that peculiar light I had come to recognize as the first sign of the hunt. "Watson," he cried, leaping to his feet so suddenly the violin bow clattered to the threadbare carpet. "The game is afoot." The telegram was curt. Dr. Elias Thornwood, Director of Rare Collections, Kew Gardens, found dead this morning in private greenhouse. Signs of violent poisoning. Apparent accident with own plants. Scotland Yard requests your immediate attendance. Lestrade. We wasted no time. A hansom cab rattled us through the fog-choked streets of Marylebone and Kensington, the wheels grinding over cold cobblestones, the horse's breath steaming in white plumes under the feeble glow of gaslights. The Thames lay somewhere to our left, invisible but ever present in its dank, muddy odor that clung to one's clothes like damp wool. Kew Gardens appeared ghostly in the mist, the great glass houses looming like crystal cathedrals half drowned in shadow. Inside Thornwood's private greenhouse the temperature shifted abruptly to a close, humid warmth that made sweat bead beneath my collar. The air was heavy with wet earth, decaying vegetation, and something sharper, gunpowder, incongruous amid orchids and vines. Overturned pots lay scattered across the gritty soil floor. Crushed petals stuck to the tiles like bloodstains. The body had already been removed to the morgue, but the chalk outline remained, absurdly small against the riot of green. Inspector Lestrade met us near the workbench, boots caked in garden mud, face drawn and weary under the hissing gas mantles. "Glad you've come, Holmes," he muttered, wiping his brow with a handkerchief that reeked faintly of cheap cigarette tobacco. "Looks like the poor devil poisoned himself by mistake. He was experimenting with deadly nightshades and South American curare vines. Convulsions, foam at the lips, classic alkaloid poisoning. Yet something feels wrong." Holmes said nothing at first. He paced with rapid, silent steps, fingers steepled beneath his chin. eyes darting over every surface. Then he knelt beside the victim's folded coat, which lay on a nearby stool of polished mahogany. Between thumb and forefinger, he lifted a single broad-leaf fragment caught in the cuff. Its edges were serrated in an unusual pattern. The surface bore a faint reddish veining and clung to a speck of gritty reddish clay mixed with what looked like fine copper filings. "A small ember, Watson," he murmured, turning the leaf slowly in the gaslight. "But it glows with meaning. This is no English plant. Observe the texture, the veining. Amazonian Strychnos toxifera, source of curare. Yet Thornwood's catalogue lists no such specimen in his collection." Lestrade snorted. "A stray leaf blown in on someone's shoe could happen in a place like this, blown through sealed glass panes in mid-November fog." Holmes replied dryly, "No, Inspector. This ember smolders. It will ignite something larger." We questioned the first witnesses, while the chill outside pressed against the glass like an unwelcome guest. Mrs. Amelia Thornwood, the botanist's wife, arrived wrapped in a threadbare shawl that smelled of lavender, trying to mask Thames mud. Her hands trembled inside worn gloves as she spoke. "Elias worked alone last night," she insisted, voice thin. "He was always alone with his plants." The head gardener, Hargrove, a burly man with calloused hands reeking of horse manure and carbolic soap, told a different story. "Heard voices after midnight, sir. Raised voices. Sounded like money troubles." Then came the nephew, Victor Thornwood, stepping from a hansom cab in gleaming boots free of garden soil, breath sweet with brandy. "Uncle was brilliant but careless," he said smoothly. "An unfortunate accident, surely." Holmes noted yet another ember. A crumpled telegram in the waste bin, ink still fresh, specimen secured, payment due, unsigned. He held it to the light. "This detail smolders, Watson. Do you see it? Do you see it, dear listener?" I confess I saw nothing remarkable at the time. Looking back now, the clues were already glowing in the dark. You, dear reader, may have noticed what I missed. The faint reddish clay on Amelia's glove cuff matching the leaf's soil exactly. We left Kew as Big Ben tolled distantly through the fog, the chill wind carrying the river's reek once more. Back at Baker Street the fire burned bright against the frozen night. Holmes lounged again, drawing upon his pipe, smoke curling upward like incense. 2 embers so far, the misplaced leaf and the cryptic telegram. A third, the absence of defensive wounds, yet the soil shows signs of violent struggle. His eyes gleamed with satisfaction. I have seen Holmes in many moods, but rarely so quickly kindled by such small sparks. The first embers glowed in the darkness. The fire of truth had begun. Chapter 2. Gathering kindling. The morning after our first visit to Kew dawned grey and bitterly cold, frost rhyming the window panes of 221B Baker Street and making the 17 steps feel even steeper as I descended for the post. Inside a sitting room the coal fire had been freshly stoked by Mrs. Hudson. Its warmth battled the chill that seeped through every crack, carrying with it the ever-present London smell of coal smoke and distant Thames mud. Holmes was already at the table, surrounded by scattered papers and the chemical apparatus still bubbling from some overnight experiment. The sharp odor of carbolic mingled with the bitter steam rising from the coffee Mrs. Hudson had just brought up, strong, black, and scalding on the tongue. "Kindling must be gathered, Watson," Holmes said without looking up, his long fingers sorting through notes like a man dealing cards. "We have 2 embers, the misplaced curare leaf and the cryptic telegram. 3 more will set the blaze properly alight." He reached into the Persian slipper for a pinch of shag tobacco, tamped it into his pipe with deliberate care, and drew a long breath. The smoke curled upward in lazy spirals, catching the weak gaslight. We took another hansom cab through the fog-shrouded streets, the wheels clattering over frozen cobblestones past the gas-lit shop fronts of Oxford Street, where early costermongers cried their wares. The journey to Kew felt longer in the cold. The horse's hooves struck sparks from the icy road, and the driver's breath steamed white above his muffler. When we arrived, the great glass houses stood silent sentinels in the mist, their iron frames dripping with condensation. Inspector Lestrade awaited us inside Thornwood's private greenhouse, stamping his feet against the chill that had somehow penetrated even this humid space. "We've spoken to more of the household," he said, voice echoing off the glass. "First, the rival Dr. Silas Blackwell, botanist from Bloomsbury. Public quarrel with Thornwood over credit for a rare orchid last year. Blackwell was waiting in the adjoining study, a gaunt figure in a threadbare tweed coat that smelled faintly of Turkish tobacco and old books. His ink-stained fingers drummed nervously on the polished mahogany desk as he spoke. Jealous? Absurd. Thornwood's work was flashy, derivative. Mine is rigorous. His military bearing, left over, I suspected, from some colonial posting, made him stand unnaturally straight. Yet his eyes flickered when Holmes mentioned the exhibition Thornwood had been preparing. Holmes moved to the window overlooking the gardens and examined a faint footprint in the soft soil just outside. Deep grooves, unusual tread. "This smoulders, Watson," he murmured. "Not an English boot. Brazilian jungle pattern, made for gripping wet clay and roots. Observe the embedded grains. Same reddish clay as on our leaf." Blackwell claimed he had not left London in months. Holmes merely smiled thinly and said nothing more. Next, we interviewed the nephew again. Victor Thornwood arrived in a gleaming hansom, boots polished to a mirror shine that bore no trace of garden mud. He sipped hot tea in the Thornwood parlor, the china cup rattling slightly against the saucer. "I was at my club in Mayfair all evening," he insisted, breath sweet with brandy even at this hour. Holmes, however, had already noted the cuff of his sleeve. A faint dusting of gritty soot, not the clean soot of Mayfair chimneys, but the heavy, copper-tinged variety found in Whitechapel foundries. "A small inconsistency," Holmes said softly. "Fan this ember with me, dear listener. What does it reveal?" Amelia Thornwood received us in the same parlor later that afternoon. The room was chilly despite the low fire. She huddled in a shawl of wet wool that carried the faint, sweetish scent of laudanum beneath her lavender perfume. "Elias had enemies in the trade," she whispered. "M.R. Reginald Vorse accused him of stealing a specimen years ago, a valuable vine from the Amazon." Her gloved hands trembled. When she removed one glove to adjust the fire screen, I saw the same reddish clay clinging to the seam. Vorse himself arrived unbidden an hour later, a prosperous man in a fur-collared overcoat, his voice booming like Big Ben through the quiet house. "Thornwood owed me for a shipment of rare plants," he declared. "Legitimate debt, nothing more." Holmes accepted a proffered cigar, noting as he did so the golden pollen grains caught in the weave of Vorse's handkerchief, pollen from a South American orchid not listed in Thornwood's official catalogue. "This detail glows," Holmes said under his breath. "Did you catch its significance, Watson?" Our last stop that day was the gardener's bothy behind the main glasshouses. Hargrove, the head man, sat on a rough wooden bench amid the overpowering smell of horse manure and damp sacking. His hands, rough as leather from years of work, clenched and unclenched as he spoke. "The professor docked my wages last month, said I was careless, but I heard nothing that night, nothing." Yet when Holmes casually opened Hargrove's toolkit hanging on the wall, a small glass vial rolled out, labeled in what appeared to be Thornwood's own handwriting, but with a telltale leftward slant. Holmes held it to the light. "Forgery," he said simply. "The careful listener will note the inconsistency." As dusk fell, the fog thickened again, wrapping Kew in grey wool. Gas lamps flickered along the paths like distant stars. Back in our hansom, the cold bit deeper. I pulled my greatcoat tighter while Holmes sat motionless, eyes half closed, reviewing the day's harvest. At Baker Street the fire had burned low. Holmes paced before it, rapid steps wearing fresh tracks in the threadbare carpet. Kindling gathered, Watson. The Brazilian footprint. Whitechapel soot forces orchid pollen. The forged vial. 4 fresh embers. Lies are kindling. Truth is the match. He drew deeply on his pipe, the bowl glowing red in the dim room. The flames approach. I confess the pattern was still hidden from me. Looking back now, the connections were already smoldering brightly. You, dear reader, may have seen what I did not. Pause here a moment. What would you deduce from a footprint from Brazil, pollen from an unlisted orchid, soot from Whitechapel, and a vial bearing a forged label? Kindling gathered, smoke rising. The flames approached. Chapter 3. The Smoulder. The third morning of the Thornwood affair brought a cruel frost that turned the cobblestones of Baker Street into treacherous glass. I descended the 17 steps carefully, the cold biting through my greatcoat, carrying with it the sharp smell of frozen coal smoke and the distant, ever-present reek of the Thames. Inside our rooms the fire roared defiantly in the grate, its warmth a blessed contrast to the icy wind outside. Holmes stood before it, back to the flames, fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes fixed on the map of London he had pinned to the wall with a chemical knife. The gas lamps hissed. The Persian slipper lay open on the mantel, its contents already depleted. Data is accumulating, Watson, he said without turning. The embers are beginning to connect. Today we fan them into something hotter. We set out for Whitechapel, following the copper tinge that Holmes had noted on Victor Thornwood's cuff. The hansom cab rattled eastward through the fog, past the grand facades of the West End giving way to narrower, grimmier streets where gaslight struggled against the gloom. The air grew thicker with coal dust, cheap cigarette smoke, and the metallic tang of foundries. Class distinctions were stark here. Threadbare coats brushed against the polished tweed of occasional gentlemen slumming for curiosity or vice. At a small copper-working foundry off Brick Lane, Holmes knelt in the gritty yard, scraping reddish clay mixed with fine filings into an envelope. Observe, Watson, this exact composition. Reddish clay, coal dust, copper residue, matches the soil clinging to our curare leaf and to Victor's cuff. He was here, despite his Mayfair alibi. The foreman, a soot-blackened man smelling strongly of sweat and metal, confirmed deliveries of Brazilian ore had arrived recently, all wrapped in leaves used as packing material. A small ember catches, Holmes murmured. Do you see it glowing, dear listener? We returned to Mayfair to confront Victor at his club. The establishment was warm and stuffy, heavy with the scent of leather chairs, sweet brandy, and expensive cigars. Victor lounged in a corner, watch chain glinting, but his composure cracked when Holmes produced the envelope of foundry dust. I went to settle a small debt, he stammered. Nothing more. Holmes noted the watch itself. Its face bore a faint golden pollen grain, identical to that on Voss's handkerchief. Another ember smoldering. The orchid pollen links Voss, Victor, and now the foundry. The pattern grows. Back at Kew we gathered the suspects once more in Thornwood's study. The room felt close, the air thick with damp earth from the adjacent greenhouse and the faint gunpowder residue that still lingered. Holmes knelt by the window, tracing a footprint in the soft border soil outside. Deep Brazilian tread, now unmistakable. He rose slowly, holding up a tiny seed he had dislodged from the tread. The spark, this seed, textured hull, unmistakable hole pattern. The kindling, Strychnos toxifera seed, source of curare, imported only by Voss's firm and recently delivered to Whitechapel foundries for packing experiments. Then came the flame. Holmes turned to me with that peculiar gleam in his eye. This reminds me powerfully of the affair I once entitled The Adventure of the Poisoned Dart. Do you recall it, Watson? A colonial diplomat fell dead in his study, curare dart in his neck, yet no weapon was found and the windows were sealed. The family physician pronounced natural causes, heart failure, but I noticed a tiny puncture wound and a single feather barb caught in the carpet fringe. Chemical analysis revealed South American curare. The dart had been fired through a blowpipe disguised as a native flute left as a gift. The murderer, a resentful business partner, had counted on the exotic nature of the poison to baffle Scotland Yard. He forgot that the ground remembers. A scuff on the sill, a barb in the fringe, traces of jungle resin on his own cufflinks. I traced the importer, confronted him in his warehouse amid crates of tribal artifacts, and watched his elaborate alibi collapse when the blowpipe was recovered from a false-bottomed trunk. The criminal mind so often believes distance and rarity will shield it, yet every plant, every dart, every footprint leaves its signature for the observant eye. Holmes straightened, voice dropping to that quiet intensity that always made the room seem smaller. Therefore, this seed tells us the curare was not merely present. It was deliberately grafted or prepared here in London, using Voss's shipment, and carried to Kew on the very boots of someone who walked Whitechapel's foundry yards. The ember has caught. The blaze is spreading. Do you see it, Watson? Do you see it, dear listener? I confess the full shape of the deduction was still forming in my mind, but the heat of it was undeniable. Looking back now, the connections were already burning brightly. You, dear reader, may have noticed what I missed at the time, the way each detail fed the next like dry tinder to flame. Holmes teaches us that observation is not passive. It is the deliberate fanning of every spark until conflagration results. In a world drowning in obvious things, the man who pauses to examine the overlooked wins the day. As we left Kew, the fog was lifting slightly, revealing the sharp outlines of the great glasshouses under a pale winter sun. Gas lamps along the path still burned, their hiss mingling with the crunch of frost under her boots. Back at Baker Street, Holmes stood once more before the fire, violin in hand, drawing a single, long note that seemed to vibrate with the case itself. The embers smolder now, he said softly. Smoke is rising. From such small embers, conflagrations grow. Chapter 4. Fanning the flames. The frost held London in its grip as the fourth day of the Thornwood investigation dawned. The sky a pale, unpromising grey that made the gas lamps along Baker Street burn longer into the morning. I woke to the familiar sounds of coal settling in the grate and Mrs. Hudson's footsteps on the 17 steps, bringing up a tray of hot tea that tasted faintly metallic against the chill still clinging to my bones. Holmes was already dressed, pacing before the fire in his mouse-colored dressing gown, the bowl of his pipe glowing like a tiny ember of its own. The room smelled of shag tobacco, ink from fresh notes, and the lingering chemical bite from last night's experiments. False trails must be burned away, Watson, he said, eyes bright with purpose. Today we apply the bellows. We began at Reginald Voss's warehouse in the shadow of London Bridge, a cavernous place where the Thames mud smell mixed with exotic scents, damp sacking, faint opium from distant crates, and the sharp green tang of freshly arrived vines. Gas lamps hissed overhead. The polished mahogany counter contrasted with the coarse rope that bound bundles of plants. Voss received us in his office, fur-collared coat thrown open, voice booming as before. I've told you everything, he insisted. Thornwood owed me money for a legitimate shipment. End of story. Holmes accepted a seat but refused the offered brandy. Instead, he produced the handkerchief Voss had used the previous day, still bearing golden orchid pollen. This pollen, Holmes said quietly, comes from a hybrid specimen Thornwood was about to exhibit, yet your shipment records show no such flower. Curious, Voss blustered, but Holmes had already moved to the ledger on the desk. A single entry had been heavily crossed out in fresh ink that still carried the faint chemical smell of recent application. You attempted to erase a delivery to Thornwood dated 2 days before his death. Why? Voss paled. Administrative error. Holmes merely smiled and pocketed a small sample of packing material, broad Amazonian leaves identical in texture to a curare fragment. From there we hastened to Dr. Silas Blackwell's Bloomsbury laboratory, A narrow house off Gower Street, where the air was thick with the bitter reek of chemical reagents and old coffee grounds. The room was stuffy despite an open window letting in the icy wind. Worn leather-bound journals lay scattered beside bubbling retorts. Blackwell greeted us stiffly, ink-stained fingers twitching. Holmes wasted no time. You were seen near Kew at midnight the night Thornwood died. A threadbare carpet fiber from your laboratory matches one caught on the greenhouse door frame. Blackwell's military posture stiffened further. I called on Thornwood to discuss the orchid credit. A civil meeting, nothing more. Yet when Holmes casually brushed past a workbench, he dislodged a small glass slide bearing the same golden pollen. You have been cultivating this hybrid yourself, Holmes observed, using grafts from Voss's curare vines. A dangerous combination. Blackwell denied it vehemently, but sweat beaded on his brow despite the chill. We returned to Kew in the fading afternoon light. Amelia Thornwood received us in the parlor once more, the low fire doing little to warm the room. She sat huddled in her wet wool shawl, the sweetish undertone of laudanum stronger now. Holmes spoke gently but directly. Your gloves, madam, bear not only the reddish foundry clay but also traces of gunpowder residue, an unusual substance for a botanist's wife. Amelia's hands flew to her mouth. Tears welled. I set off a small firecracker in the greenhouse the night before last. Elias was furious about money. I wanted to frighten him, make him listen, but I left before anything happened. Her confession hung in the air like smoke. Holmes nodded once. A red herring, perhaps, or a desperate act. Either way, the ember flares. The final confrontation of the day took place in the gardener's bothy as dusk fell. Hargrove sat on his rough bench, surrounded by the overpowering smell of horse manure and damp straw. His calloused hands clenched when Holmes produced the forged file from his toolkit. You hid this, Holmes said. Why? Hargrove's shoulders sagged. Protection, sir. The professor threatened to sack me. I thought if I kept something of his, something dangerous, I could bargain. But I never used it. Swear it. Holmes examined the vial again under the flickering gaslight. Diluted, he announced. Harmless. A bluff. Another false fire dying out. As we left Kew, the fog was rolling in thick once more, muffling the crunch of our boots on the frozen path and the distant chime of Big Ben. The hansom cab carried us back through gas-lit streets where shadows stretched long and cold. At Baker Street, Holmes threw off his coat and stood before the hearth, watching the flames leap. Some fires have guttered out, he said softly, drawing on his pipe until the bowl glowed red. The diluted vial was a diversion. Amelia's firecracker explains the gunpowder smell, but not the death. Victor's Whitechapel visit was dead, not murder. Yet other flames burn brighter. The crossed-out ledger entry, Blackwell's hidden pollen slide, the gunpowder on Amelia's gloves pointing to someone who knew how to stage a struggle. He turned to me, eyes gleaming in the firelight. The true blaze is near, Watson. We have fanned hard today. I have seen Holmes in many moods, but the controlled energy he displayed now was rare and exhilarating. Looking back, the false trails had served their purpose. They burned away the chaff, leaving only the pure fuel of truth. You, dear reader, may have noticed which details refuse to be extinguished. Pause and consider. When so many small fires die, which one grows stronger? False fires died. The true flame burned brighter. Chapter 5. The fire catches. The fifth day broke with a sudden, startling clarity. No fog, only a pale winter sun cutting through the London sky like a blade. At 221B Baker Street, the coal fire burned high, throwing warm light across the scattered papers and the chemical apparatus still faintly steaming from Holmes's overnight work. The room smelled of strong coffee, bitter on the tongue, and the sweet curl of shag tobacco as Holmes filled his pipe from the Persian slipper. I had barely finished my breakfast when he leapt up, energy crackling around him like static before a storm. "The embers have aligned, Watson," he declared, eyes alight with that peculiar fire I knew so well. "Today the blaze catches in earnest. We return to Kew, and we bring every suspect with us. We summon them all by urgent telegram. Reginald Voss, Silas Blackwell, Amelia Thornwood, Victor Thornwood, and Hargrove the gardener." Inspector Lestrade met us at the private greenhouse, stamping his feet against the frozen ground outside, while the glasshouse itself remained stuffy and humid within. The air was thick with wet earth, decaying leaves, and the faint metallic tang that still lingered from the night of the murder. Gas mantles hissed overhead. Sunlight slanted through the panes in sharp, dusty beams. The 5 suspects stood in a loose semicircle near Thornwood's workbench, faces taut under the harsh light. Amelia clutched her shawl. Victor shifted from foot to foot. Voss loomed with folded arms. Blackwell's ink-stained fingers twitched, and Hargrove stood stolidly, smelling faintly of horse manure and carbolic soap even here. Holmes began without preamble, pacing slowly before them, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "The spark," he said, producing the broad curare leaf fragment from his pocket and holding it up so the reddish veining caught the light, "was this misplaced specimen, Strychnos toxifera, source of curare, not native to Thornwood's collection. It clung to his cuff because someone placed it there deliberately." He moved to the workbench and lifted a small glass slide, taken that morning from Blackwell's laboratory. The kindling, golden pollen from a hybrid orchid, identical on this slide, on Voss's handkerchief, and on Victor's watch chain. A plant Thornwood intended to exhibit as his own discovery. But the hybrid was not natural. It was grafted, curare vines spliced into nightshade stock using techniques only a skilled botanist with access to Voss's shipments could achieve. He turned to Blackwell. "You, Dr. Blackwell, cultivated this graft in your Bloomsbury laboratory. You used packing leaves from Voss's recent Brazilian delivery, leaves that carry the telltale reddish clay and copper filings of Whitechapel foundries. You walked those foundry yards in imported jungle boots, leaving the deep tread prints we found outside this very window." Blackwell's face drained of color. "Preposterous." Holmes raised a hand. The flame burns brighter still. "This recalls powerfully the case I once entitled The Adventure of the Speckled Band. A stepfather, driven by greed, trained a deadly swamp adder to kill his stepdaughters via a bell rope lowered through a ventilator. He believed the exotic creature and the locked room would baffle investigators forever. Yet I noticed milk saucers, a strange whistle in the night, and a faint scent of venom. The ground beneath the ventilator bore tiny punctures from the snake's passage. A single speckled scale caught in the fringe told the tale. Greed masked as family tragedy collapsed when the method was exposed. So too here. The criminal believed a botanical hybrid, beautiful, subtle, deadly, would pass as accident. But plants, like snakes, leave signatures. Vein patterns do not lie. Grafting scars do not vanish. He faced the group again, voice dropping to that quiet intensity that always seemed to shrink the room. "The blaze then, you Blackwell, forged the telegram, specimens secured, payment due, and delivered the grafted nightshade to Thornwood under cover of darkness. During your midnight confrontation, you forced him to handle the poisoned bloom. Convulsions followed swiftly. To stage a struggle, you set off a small gunpowder flare, residue found on Amelia's gloves when she innocently touched the same bench the next morning. The curare acted before any defensive wounds could form. You planted the foreign leaf on the body to suggest an experiment gone wrong. Jealousy over the orchid credit, combined with impending financial ruin from Thornwood's exhibition, supplied the motive." Blackwell lunged forward with a strangled cry, hands outstretched. I stepped between them, military reflexes sharp, and pinned his arms until Lestrade's constables rushed in. The greenhouse rang with sudden shouts, the crunch of boots on gritty soil, the clink of handcuffs. Blackwell sagged. "He was going to take everything," he whispered. "Everything I worked for. Holmes stood motionless amid the chaos, watching as the truth burned away the last shadows. "The fire has caught," he said softly. "Nothing can extinguish it now." We left Kew as the winter sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the frozen paths. The hansom cab rattled back through streets now bathed in the clear, cold light of late afternoon. At Baker Street the fire still burned bright in the grate. Holmes sank into his armchair, drawing deeply on his pipe until the bowl glowed like a captured ember. "A major breakthrough indeed," he murmured, eyes half closed in satisfaction. "The blaze illuminates every corner." I confess the speed of the revelation left me breathless. Looking back, every detail had pointed to this moment. The leaf, the pollen, the forged label, the gunpowder. You, dear reader, may have seen the shape of the truth before I did. Pause here and ask yourself. Before Holmes spoke, what did the curare leaf, the orchid pollen, and the grafting evidence tell you? The fire caught. Nothing could extinguish it now. Chapter 6. Spreading Blaze. With Silas Blackwell in custody, the deductive fire spread rapidly, illuminating secrets that had long festered in the shadows of London's fog-bound streets. The sixth day dawned crisp and clear, the frost still clinging to the rooftops of Baker Street as I descended the 17 steps. The cold air sharp with coal smoke, and the faint metallic bite of the Thames carried on the wind. Inside our rooms the coal fire burned steadily, its warmth a welcome contrast to the frozen world outside. Holmes sat motionless by the hearth, fingers steepled, eyes half closed in the peculiar state of reflection I had come to recognize as the afterglow of revelation. "Past motives must now blaze forth, Watson," he said quietly. "The conflagration is not yet complete until every hidden ember is exposed." We returned first to Blackwell's Bloomsbury laboratory, now sealed by Lestrade's men. The air inside remained thick with the acrid smell of chemical reagents, old coffee grounds, and the faint sweet rot of neglected plant specimens. Gas lamps hissed overhead. Worn leather journals lay open on the workbench beside bubbling retorts that had cooled overnight. Holmes moved methodically through the papers, lifting letters and account books with gloved hands. "Here," he said, holding up a thin sheaf of correspondence. Blackwell's bank statements, overdrawn for months, threatening notices from creditors. Thornwood's forthcoming exhibition would have secured him a fellowship and a substantial grant. Blackwell's own hybrid orchid, his life's work, would be eclipsed forever. The motive burned clear. Professional jealousy sharpened by financial desperation. We next visited Amelia Thornwood at the Kew residence. She received us in the parlor, the low fire crackling feebly against the chill that seeped through the lace-curtained windows. Her shawl hung loosely now. The sweetish scent of laudanum had faded, replaced by simple lavender soap. She spoke softly, eyes clear for the first time since the tragedy. "Elias was consumed by his plants," she admitted. "The marriage grew cold years ago. Victor offered kindness, nothing more." Holmes nodded once. Her affair had been a red herring, painful but irrelevant to murder. She was cleared, the shadow lifting from her face like fog before the sun. Victor Thornwood met us at his Mayfair club, the warm scent of leather and sweet brandy enveloping the room. He looked haggard but relieved. "I went to Whitechapel only to settle gambling debts with a man connected to Voss's shipments," he confessed. "Uncle never knew. I swear I never touched him." Holmes examined his watch chain again. The pollen grain had been accidental transfer from a handshake with Blackwell days earlier. Victor's guilt burned away. Mere foolishness, not murder. Reginald Voss arrived at Scotland Yard under escort, his booming voice subdued. In a small interview room smelling of ink and cheap tobacco, he admitted smuggling rare specimens to avoid duty. "Thornwood threatened to expose me unless I forgave the debt," he said. "But I never killed him. I was in Dover that night." Witnesses. Lestrade confirmed the alibi. Voss's crime was greed, not bloodshed. His complicity ended at supplying the raw materials. Hargrove, the gardener, remained at Kew. We found him in the bothy, hands rough with soil, the overpowering smell of horse manure and damp straw unchanged. "I hid the vial to protect myself," he repeated, "but I never meant harm." Holmes tested the contents once more, still harmless dilution. Hargrove's grudge had been smoke, not fire. The true web now lay exposed. Blackwell alone had walked from Whitechapel to Kew under cover of fog, using London's back alleys and used to avoid notice. He carried the grafted nightshade in a plain paper parcel, confronted Thornwood at midnight, forced the poisoned bloom upon him, and staged the scene with gunpowder and the planted leaf. Every suspect had been touched by motive or opportunity, yet only one hand had wielded the fatal graft. In quiet reflection as we rode back through the gas-lit streets, I considered an ember from this case that still glowed in memory. The subtle vein pattern of the hybrid orchid, so easily overlooked yet so damning. It recalled powerfully the affair Holmes once entitled A Study in Scarlet. Their vengeful cabman, Jefferson Hope, used 2 alkaloid pills, one harmless, one fatal, to execute justice across an ocean for a decades-old wrong. He believed chemistry and distance would shield him. Yet Holmes traced bloodstains in a Brixton house, cabwheel ruts in the fog, and a single pill casing to unravel the scheme. The criminal mind, then as now, erred in assuming that poison, whether pill or plant, could hide its nature from the observant eye. Nature remembers, in blood, in soil, in vein and scar. Deduction is merely the art of listening when nature speaks. Dear listener, carry this ember with you. The smallest detail, a vein, a seed, a speck of pollen, holds the power to illuminate the darkest deception. In a world of elaborate lies, truth is often the simplest thing, waiting only for someone brave enough to look closely. As evening fell, the gas lamps along Fleet Street flared brighter against the gathering dusk. Back at Baker Street, Holmes stood before the fire, violin in hand, drawing a single, sustained note that seemed to resonate with the case itself. "The blaze has spread," he said softly. "Every shadow stands revealed." The blaze illuminated what had long been hidden in shadow. Chapter 7. The Conflagration. The 7th day arrived with a bitter wind sweeping through London, rattling the windows of Scotland Yard, where the final blaze of revelation would be kindled. I descended the 17 steps at Baker Street with a sense of culmination, the coal fire behind me still crackling warmly against the frozen morning air that carried the sharp reek of Thames mud and distant coal smoke. Holmes walked beside me in silence, his long coat whipping about him, pipe clenched between his teeth, the bowl glowing faintly like a captured ember. We had summoned every principal actor to the Yard's interview room. Silas Blackwell in irons, Reginald Vorse under caution, Victor Thornwood pale but composed, Amelia Thornwood steady at last, and Hargrove standing awkwardly in his gardener's boots. The room was stuffy despite the chill outside, warmed only by a small coal grate whose flames danced weakly against the cold stone walls. Gas lamps hissed overhead. The air smelled of ink, cheap tobacco from Lestrade's pipe, and the faint metallic tang that seemed to follow this case like a ghost. Inspector Lestrade stood by the door, arms folded, while a constable took notes on foolscap that rustled softly. Holmes stepped to the center of the circle, fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes gleaming with that peculiar light of absolute certainty. "Gentlemen and madam," he began quietly, "the time has come to review every ember and watch them unite into one unquenchable blaze." He produced the broad curare fragment first, holding it to the gaslight so the reddish veining caught every eye. Ember the first. This Amazonian Strychnos toxifera leaf, found on Thornwood's cuff, not part of his collection, planted deliberately to suggest an experiment gone wrong. Next he drew from his pocket the small glass slide bearing golden orchid pollen. Ember the second. hybrid orchid pollen, matching specimens on Voss's handkerchief, Victor's watch chain, and, crucially, Blackwell's laboratory slide, a plant Thornwood claimed as his own discovery, but grafted in secret using curare vine stock from Voss's Brazilian shipment. He turned to the ledger page Voss had reluctantly provided, pointing to the heavily crossed-out entry. Ember the 3rd. This erased delivery record, dated 2 days before the murder, showing Voss supplied the packing leaves that carried the telltale reddish clay and copper filings of Whitechapel foundries. Holmes paced slowly, boots clicking on the stone floor. Ember the 4th. The forged telegram. Specimen secured. Payment due, written in Blackwell's distinctive left slanting hand, delivered to Lord Thornwood into late-night work. He lifted the small vial Hargrove had hidden. Ember the 5th. This diluted extract, harmless, planted in the gardener's toolkit as a diversion, a red herring that burned itself out quickly. Finally, he indicated a small envelope of gunpowder residue. Ember the 6th. Traces found on Amelia's gloves and in the greenhouse soil, not from a weapon, but from a simple firecracker flare used to simulate violent struggle and mask the quiet action of curare. Holmes stopped before Blackwell, who sat hunched, face ashen. When you have eliminated the impossible, accidental poisoning from plants not in Thornwood's possession, random accident amid locked greenhouses, mere debt or jealousy without method, what remains, however improbable, is murder by botanical graft. You, Dr. Blackwell, cultivated the hybrid nightshade in your laboratory. You walked Whitechapel's foundry yards in Brazilian boots to collect packing materials that would disguise your movements. You delivered the poison bloom under cover of fog, confronted Thornwood at midnight, forced him to handle the fatal flower. Convulsions followed swiftly. No defensive wounds, because curare paralyzes before panic fully sets in. You scattered pots, planted the foreign leaf, ignited a small flare for effect, and departed through the back alleys you knew so well from your nocturnal visits. Blackwell's shoulders shook. He was going to ruin me, he whispered. The fellowship, the grant, everything I had worked for since India. He stole my orchid and called it his. Holmes's voice remained calm, almost gentle. Elementary, my dear Lestrade. The criminal mind constructs elaborate deceptions, yet forgets that nature, veins, pollen, soil, betrays every lie. The truth blazes forth. No darkness can survive such light. A heavy silence fell. Lestrade stepped forward, nodding to the constable. Silas Blackwell, I arrest you for the murder of Elias Thornwood. As the irons clinked and Blackwell was led away, the others exhaled as though a great weight had lifted. Amelia touched my arm briefly, eyes shining with relief. Victor stood straighter, the shadow gone from his face. Voss muttered something about cooperating fully with customs. Hargrove simply nodded, as though justice had been a plant long overdue for pruning. We left the yard as the winter sun broke through the clouds, casting pale light across the frozen Thames. The hansom cab rattled back toward Baker Street, the wind still biting, but no longer oppressive. Inside a room's Holmes sank into his armchair, drawing deeply on his pipe until the smoke curled upward like the last wisps of a dying fire. The truth has blazed, he said softly. Nothing remains hidden. I have witnessed many of Holmes' triumphs, but rarely one so complete, so thoroughly illuminated. Before he spoke, the careful listener might have already connected the leaf, the pollen, the graft, the flare. What would you have deduced from those 6 embers burning together? Truth blazed forth. No darkness could survive such light. Chapter 8. Ashes and Justice. The arrest of Silas Blackwell marked the moment when the great deductive blaze began to settle into glowing coals. London awoke on the 8th day to a rare winter clarity. No fog shrouded the streets, only a pale sun that glinted off frost-covered rooftops and turned the Thames into a ribbon of cold silver. At 221B Baker Street, the coal fire still burned steadily in the grate, its warmth a quiet comfort after the storm of revelation. The room smelled of fresh ink from my journal, the lingering curl of Holmes's shag tobacco, and the faint, comforting aroma of Mrs. Hudson's breakfast tray, hot tea and toast that tasted of simple normalcy returning. I found Holmes lounging in his armchair, legs stretched toward the hearth, fingers steepled as he reviewed the morning newspapers. Headlines screamed the news. Botanist arrested INKEW poison murder. Rivals jealous graft exposed. He folded the paper with a faint smile. Justice rises from the ashes, Watson, he murmured, as it always must. The legal machinery moved swiftly. Blackwell was arraigned that very morning at Bow Street Magistrates' Court, a grim building whose stone corridors echoed with the shuffle of boots and the low murmur of clerks. The courtroom was chill despite a small coal stove in the corner. The air carried the sharp scent of polished wood and the musty dampness of old legal papers. Blackwell stood in the dock, once proud military bearing broken, shoulders hunched beneath the coarse prison tunic. His face was ashen, eyes hollow as the magistrate read the charge. Willful murder by poison. He offered no plea, only a whispered admission when asked if he understood the proceedings. Lestrade, standing beside us in the public gallery, nodded grimly. He'll go to trial at the Old Bailey next month. The evidence is ironclad. Your embers, Holmes, every one of them. Outside the court, a small knot of reporters surged forward, notebooks poised, but Blackwell was hurried away in a closed van, its wheels crunching over frozen cobblestones. The crowd dispersed slowly, breath steaming in the cold air, voices buzzing with the scandal of a respected scientist turned killer. Amelia Thornwood waited for us on the steps of the Kew residence that afternoon. The great glasshouses stood silent behind her, their panes catching the weak sunlight like mirrors. She wore a simple black dress, but her posture was straighter, her hands steady as she clasped mine in greeting. The sweetish undertone of laudanum had vanished entirely. Only lavender soap remained. "D.R. Watson, M.R. Holmes," she said softly. "I cannot thank you enough. The shadow has lifted. Elias's collection will be preserved, properly catalogued this time. I intend to endow a small fellowship in his name, but under honest oversight." Tears glistened briefly. Then she smiled, a small, genuine light after months of darkness. "I am free to grieve properly now, and to live." Victor Thornwood met us later at his Mayfair club, the warm scent of leather chairs and sweet brandy wrapping around us like a familiar cloak. He looked years younger, the haunted look gone from his eyes. "I've settled the debts," he told us quietly. "No more Whitechapel midnight runs. Uncle's will left me enough to start again, honestly this time. I've even offered to assist at Kew during the exhibition. Atonement, perhaps." He raised his glass in a silent toast to truth. Reginald Vorse faced his own reckoning at the Custom House later that day. The air there smelled of ink, sealing wax, and the river mud carried in on boots. He sat in a small office, fur-collared coat discarded, speaking freely to the excise officers. "I smuggled specimens, yes, but murder? Never. I'll cooperate fully. Names, dates, routes. Let the record show I had no hand in Thornwood's death." Lestrade assured us the penalties would be fines and restrictions, not prison. Vorse's empire would shrink, but he would survive, chastened. Hargrove remained at his post in the Kew Gardener's bothy, hands once more deep in the honest soil. The overpowering smell of horse manure and damp straw greeted us as we said farewell. He wiped his palms on his rough apron and met Holmes's gaze directly. "I kept my job, sir. The professor's gone, but the plants still need tending. Thank you for seeing I wasn't the one." His voice was gruff, but gratitude shone in his eyes. He returned to his work with a steady tread, the crunch of gravel under his boots a quiet rhythm of continuity. Back at Baker Street as evening fell, the gas lamps along the street flared one by one, their hiss mingling with the distant chime of Big Ben. Holmes stood by the window, watching the lights appear like scattered embers across the darkening city. Each character has reacted as nature intended, he observed. The guilty burned away. The innocent breathe easier. London's fog may return tomorrow, but today the air is clear. I sat opposite him, journal open on my knee, pen scratching softly against the page. The case had transformed us all in small ways. Amelia from despair to quiet resolve, Victor from recklessness to reform, Walsh from arrogance to cooperation, Hargrove from suspicion to security. Even Blackwell, in his fall, had illuminated the peril of unchecked ambition. Justice, imperfect and human, had risen nonetheless. The fire in the grate settled into a steady glow, coals shifting with soft sounds. Holmes drew on his pipe, smoke curling upward in lazy spirals. From ashes, he said softly, justice rose, as it always must. Chapter 9. Embers cool. The 9th day following the arrest of Silas Blackwell brought a gentle thaw to London, as though the city itself exhaled after holding its breath for too long. The frost that had gripped the cobblestones of Baker Street melted into shallow puddles, reflecting the pale winter sun. The air carried a softer dampness now, mingled with the familiar smells of coal smoke, wet wool from passing pedestrians, and the distant, muddy breath of the Thames. At 221B the coal fire burned low and steady, its warmth no longer desperate but comforting, like an old friend settling into quiet companionship. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps on the 17th step sounded lighter this morning as she brought up the breakfast tray, hot tea tasting faintly of bergamot, toast crisp and buttered, the simple sense of normal life returning. I sat at the writing table, journal open, pen moving slowly across the page as I recorded the final threads of resolution. Holmes lounged opposite in his armchair, legs stretched toward the hearth, pipe drawing lazily, the smoke curling upward in thin, contented spirals. He had exchanged his mouse-colored dressing gown for a proper coat, a sign that the fever of the chase had cooled at last. Embers cool slowly, Watson, he observed, eyes half closed in reflection. But when they do, peace settles like ash on a dying fire. News arrived by morning post and telegram, each piece confirming the transformations begun in the blaze of truth. Amelia Thornwood wrote first, a short, graceful note on heavy cream paper scented faintly with lavender. She had taken up residence in the Kew director's quarters, overseeing the final preparations for the winter exhibition. The hybrid orchid has been removed from display, she wrote, and relabeled honestly as Blackwell's work, with a small plaque acknowledging Elias's contributions, but not his claim. The gardens bloom again without deception. I find myself walking the paths at dawn, breathing freely for the first time in years. Her handwriting was steady, no longer trembling. The woman who had once huddled in shawls of wet wool now stood tall in the light. Victor Thornwood sent a telegram from Mayfair, terse but sincere. Debts cleared. Accepted assistant curator position ATKEW. Exhibition opens next week under NEW Honest Catalogue. Thank YOU. The once reckless nephew had traded brandy-soaked nights for early mornings among plants. His polished boots now regularly dusted with honest garden soil. Atonement had taken root. Reginald Vorse, facing fines and trade restrictions, had quietly restructured his importing business. A brief note from his solicitor confirmed full cooperation with customs. No further charges would be pressed. M.R. Vorse intends to limit future shipments to documented, duty-paid specimens, the letter stated. He expresses gratitude for the exposure of Blackwell's greater crime, which spared him a murder accusation. The booming importer had shrunk in stature, but not in survival. His empire would endure, chastened and legitimate. Hargrove remained at his post, the bothy unchanged in its earthy smells of horse manure, damp straw, and carbolic soap. We had visited him the previous afternoon. He greeted us with a firm handshake, hands rough and steady. Plants don't judge, gentlemen, he said simply. They just grow if you tend them right. I'll keep tending. His grudge had evaporated like morning mist. In its place grew quiet pride in the gardens he had always loved. Even Silas Blackwell's fate settled into its final shape. From Pentonville prison came word of Valestrodi. The man spent his days in the library, poring over botanical texts, as though still seeking some elusive discovery. The once proud scientist had become a shadow. His ambition burned away to ash. Justice, cold and impartial, held him fast. London itself seemed transformed. The fog that had shrouded the city during the investigation lifted day by day. Gas lamps along the streets burned less urgently now, their hiss softer against the clearer night skies. Class distinctions remained. Fine carriages still rolled past ragged street sellers, but the air felt lighter, as though the deductive fire had scorched away a layer of deception that had clung to more than one life. At Baker Street that evening, Holmes stood by the window, watching the lamps flare one by one along Baker Street. The room was quiet save for the soft crackle of the fire and the occasional chime of Big Ben carried on the wind. He turned to me, pipe in hand. "The transformations are complete," he said. "From shadow to suspicion, from hunted to absolved, from blazing revelation to quiet aftermath. The mystery that was cold and shrouded has become illuminated, then cooled. London breathes easier tonight." I closed my journal with a soft snap, the weight of the case settling into memory like embers into ash. Amelia would flourish in her new role. Victor would rebuild with purpose. Vorse would trade access for caution. Hargrove would tend his plants in peace. Blackwell would face the long consequence of his choices. Even we, Holmes and I, felt the subtle shift, from the electric tension of pursuit to the calm satisfaction of resolution. The fire in the grate burned low, coals glowing faintly red. Holmes drew one last pull on his pipe, then set it aside. "The embers have cooled at last," he murmured. "London breathes easier." Chapter 10. By the fire at Baker Street. The 10th day after Silas Blackwell's confession brought a quiet, restorative calm to Baker Street. The winter sun had set early, leaving the sky a deep indigo pierced by the steady glow of gas lamps along the thoroughfare. Inside 221B, the coal fire crackled steadily in the grate, throwing warm orange light across the familiar clutter. Scattered chemical papers, the Persian slipper half open on the mantel, the Stradivarius resting in its open case, and the faint hiss of the gasogene beside the tantalus. The 17 steps from Mrs. Hudson's hallway below were silent now. She had retired after leaving a small decanter of brandy and 2 glasses on the side table. I sat in my usual armchair, legs stretched toward the hearth, journal closed on my knee. The bitter cold outside pressed against the window panes, but here the warmth wrapped around us like an old greatcoat. Holmes lounged opposite in his mouse-colored dressing gown, pipe in hand, drawing slow, contemplative pulls so that the smoke rose in lazy blue spirals toward the ceiling. His eyes reflected the firelight, calm now, the fierce gleam of pursuit replaced by a deeper, quieter satisfaction. "A satisfying conclusion, Watson," he said at length, voice low against the soft crackle of coals. "Botanical forensics, a new ember in the science of deduction. Who would have thought a single vein pattern could send a man to the gallows?" I nodded, reaching for the brandy. The liquid burned pleasantly on the tongue, sweet and warming after days of tension. "The newspapers are still full of it. The Q poisoner, they've made quite a sensation of Blackwell's downfall. Yet the true marvel was how small details, pollen grains, grafting scars, foundry dust, revealed the whole." Holmes leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, pipe bowl glowing red as he spoke. "Precisely. The world is full of obvious things which nobody observes. A leaf fragment on a cuff, a speck of pollen on a watch chain, a footprint in soft soil. These are not accidents of nature. They are signatures. The criminal believes his elaborate deception will shield him, yet he forgets that every action leaves a trace. Blackwell grafted curare into nightshade thinking beauty would mask lethality. He planted the foreign leaf to suggest accident. He used a flare to simulate struggle. Each choice was clever, yet each left an ember, and embers, once noticed, ignite. He paused, drawing again on his pipe, the smoke culling like fog in the lamplight. This case recalls the Hound of the Baskervilles, in its reliance on deception through nature. Their spectral hound was conjured with phosphorus and legend to conceal murder for inheritance. Holmes traced paw prints in Dartmoor mud, a phosphorescent smear on a boot, a hidden kennel on the moor. The criminal mind erred in assuming terror and distance would defeat observation. Here, too, ambition and exoticism were the mask, yet soil remembers copper filings, pollen remembers its parent plant. Veins remember the knife that joined them. The observant eye defeats every artifice. I sipped my brandy, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. You teach us, Holmes, that deduction is not magic. It is patience. It is the refusal to dismiss the trivial. A seed hole, a left slanting forgery, a gunpowder residue on a glove. Any one might be overlooked. Together they blaze. Holmes's eyes gleamed with quiet amusement. Data, data, data. I cannot make bricks without clay. The criminal's fatal error is always the same. He underestimates the ground beneath his feet, the air he breathes, the plants he manipulates. Nature is the greatest witness. Watson, she never lies. She simply waits for someone to listen. We sat in companionable silence for a time, the fire settling with soft pops, the distant chime of Big Ben marking the hour. News of the others had reached us that day. Amelia Thornwood's exhibition opened to quiet acclaim. The hybrid orchid displayed with full attribution to Blackwell, and a memorial note for Elias. Victor had proven diligent in his new role, earning cautious praise from the Q board. Vorse paid his fines and resumed trade under stricter oversight. Hargrove tended the glasshouses with the same steady hands, content in obscurity. Holmes set his pipe aside and steepled his fingers. Observation defeats deception because deception requires effort, while truth requires only existence. The murderer constructs. The detective merely uncovers. In the end, the simplest explanation prevails, not because it is easy, but because it is inevitable. I smiled, closing my eyes for a moment against the fire's glow. I have recorded many of your cases, Holmes, but this one reminds me why we persist. Small embers, ignored by most, light paths through the darkest fog. London may shroud itself again tomorrow, but tonight the air is clear. He nodded once, a rare gesture of agreement. Until the next ember glows, dear listener, the game is always afoot. The fire burned low, coals shifting gently. Outside, the gas lamps hissed on. Inside, peace settled like ash on a hearth long kindled and now content to rest.